Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture for Lit and Film online. Today, we're going to discuss the rule of thirds, general kind of composition theory, and then the quadrant system. And this goes back to what we talked about previously with using angles to create kind of mise en scène, right? That mise en scène, that everything is a story within the frame. So in this case, now we're going to use angles and all sorts of things to create that mise en scène, right? So the rule of thirds, if you haven't taken any kind of photography course, you may know it because of the kind of devices that you use to take pictures, because sometimes this grid does appear. But basically, it's a fundamental composition principle that most photographers and cinematographers, directors of photography, use to create a shot, right? So the guideline proposes that an image should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal and 2 equally spaced vertical lines. So again, this grid right here. All important compositional elements should be placed along those lines or their intersections to create an interesting shot. And again, I put a video up so you could kind of see more about the differences between flat compositions versus interesting compositions. But I'll just run through a couple of different examples with the films that we've seen already. So how does this apply to the rule of thirds? Right? How is Akira Kurosawa? Well, we draw our vertical lines and then we draw horizontal lines. And you can see basically, we're not centering everything, right? That's usually kind of an indicator of kind of an amateur photographer, right? Just putting things in portrait centered, right? What we have here is, notice in these grids, right, we occupy our, tragic hero, right? And then we have really interesting kind of work with light and dark between the grids. We interesting between human, right? And notice again, not centered but off, right? And so that gives our eyes a chance to wander through the image. And this idea with the rule of thirds is that, again, just a regular composition, technically a non a flat, it's not three-dimensional. However, using angles and using the grids, you could figure out a way to make these compositions very interesting and pleasing to the eye, right? And so again, it's a really important kind of concept to create kind of a visual story, even because when we look at the grids, a lot of times there's stories being told, right? And that will kind of go into another kind of concept in a moment. But same thing here, right? Why do we have these things, right? Especially during this time, right? You look at, okay, we don't necessarily need to frame the shot in this way. The car is kind of what we want to see, but we're doing this to create suspense, but to also create kind of a visual story, right? We know, and then look at the dynamite, not centered. So it gives us a chance for our audience to really look at the image and figure out, okay, what is happening in this image, right? What should I draw my eyes to? How should I kind of understand the mise en scène of the shot, right? The story being told, right? And again, we get a huge range in the foreground of the fake food, the fake baby, the dynamite, knowing that it's a trap, right? And again, even if we separate it with the horizontal versus vertical, a lot of times the story elements are there for the mise en scène, right? Again, the dynamite heavily in the foreground, our car approaching, towards us, so it creates a sense of movement. And again, it's a really popular kind of technique. Not every photographer and cinematographer will use this because there are other rules, but in general, it is one of the most basic and reoccurring rules that cinematographers use. Notice too here, again, we could technically center, our Machine Gun Joe, right? But we're not, right? He's not going to be fully centered, and look at how these intersections work, right? We're going to just put him in these grids and think about the kind of similarity between this image and the one with our, Throne of Blood, Macbeth character, right? So a lot of times, just to create, again, a sense of dynamic kind of composition, we're going to use these rule of thirds to create kind of a more interesting shot. So it's not so flat, it's not so boring. So when we look at, again, every kind of way we could frame a shot, whether we're dealing with dialogue scene, an action scene, a lot of times, again, the rule of thirds will apply. Notice here, this is a strategic way to draw attention to our highest paid actor our next highest paid actor, and then our least highest paid actor, right? So a lot of times what you can do with especially cinematographers is that you can get a good frame to highlight our main star, but also again still keep everyone in shot, right? And again, notice the grid too in terms of eye lines, right? Which we'll get into in another kind of mode. Is that it's very important that even the eye lines aren't on the same grid, right? They're in separate grids to again create a sense of dominance, to create a sense of superiority, to create a sense of again knowing who our actor is. And so again, it's all these kind of different ways that we could frame a shot. Now, we get into an idea further with static versus dynamic composition. So another compositional theory throws out necessarily the rule of thirds and then treats kind of ideas with horizontal lines and vertical lines as a main way to create dynamic shots and interesting shots. So static composition means the majority of lines on a page are horizontal or vertical. So the theory asserts that horizontal and vertical lines can have kind of a soothing, calm, or tranquil effect on the observer. So if you want to build up suspense, you start with very horizontal and vertical heavy lines, then move on to diagonals and so forth to create, again, an interesting kind of way of horror, suspense, and all this. So let's draw our lines and then let's kind of look at an image, right? So all of these lines here, right, just create a good kind of static composition, right? We just want an audience to watch our main actor walk through the city, right? Nothing right now is happening that is super dynamic or super complex, right? So it's a way to kind of ease the audience, right? So when we build up tension later, we could do a little bit more with that, right? The same thing here, right? When we have shots that are very just plain, ordinary. Notice how we still could kind of apply the rule of thirds, but notice how she is more centered, right, than we see in the previous examples that I was giving to you about the rule of thirds. So we just want just a regular shot so the audience isn't concerned or suspenseful or something, right? We just want to keep it just a regular paced idea. The opposite is dynamic composition, where this requires so many uses of diagonal lines. So what we see is this theory says that diagonals are unsettling. They can result in sense of movement, energy, excitement, anything that generates a dynamic shot. They can also help with claustrophobic feeling and disorientation. So a lot of times when you see drunk characters, we'll use dynamic composition. Notice immediately the difference between the static ones and the dynamic one. Already we have all these lines right in place that are diagonal. It's a still shot, of course, but what do we have? All these different diagonals between the shadows, the objects, and everything to create a sense of urgency, to create a sense of excitement. Same thing too if we want to create a sense of horror or sense of grotesqueness. What do? We create dynamic shots, right? We see the abundance of now diagonal lines to really get into an aspect of just grotesqueness, horror, disorientation, right? And so it just helps to create those moods and tones. Another important kind of angle that helps tell the story are high angle shots and low angle shots. And these can overlap with rule of thirds, they could overlap with dynamic or static compositions. But basically, the camera looks down on the subject from a high angle, and the point of focus often gets swallowed up, right? So that is kind of a key issue. High angle shots can make the subject seem vulnerable or powerless when applied with the correct mood, setting, and effects. And that's kind of a key issue is that powerlessness. Notice when our main character is getting beat up, we see a high angle shot, right? We're looking down on our character as he's getting beat, right? To create a sense of vulnerability, to create a sense of dominance for the other character, submission for the other. So we see this time and time again with high angle shots. Notice the use of the high angle shot for Throne of Blood here. So all of his soldiers, right, are small. They're ants, right, where he is feels that he is a god, right. So we're using this high angle shot to create a sense of dynamic mise en scène, right? Where we see that kind of visual metaphor where he feels like he's charged. Look again in terms, especially the rule of thirds idea, but we could also look how large he is compared with his army, right? That he just sees them as expendable, where he thinks he is a godlike creature. So the opposite is a low angle shot, which is to create a sense of superiority a lot of times for the characters that we want to show. So this shot from a camera angle is positioned low on the vertical axis, anywhere below the eye line, and it always is looking up. Sometimes it's directly below the subject's feet, other times it's playing around with the angle, but psychologically, the effect of a low angle shot is to make the subject look strong and powerful. So look at the example here we have from Death Race, right? When he's victorious, when he defeated the president, right? Now we get a low angle shot to show that he is victorious. And we even get, of course, that kind of pose that is very synonymous with that. Same idea here, right? So instead of now focusing on the vulnerability of our main character, what we're doing is we're going to focus on the superiority, the powerfulness of the aggressor, right? So we use a lot of times the low angle shots to again create a mise en scène, but it's the idea that we're creating a power dynamic. So high angle shots, low angle shots always create power dynamics. There is even a trunk shot, right? So anytime there's an assassin, typically you're going to get the low angle for any kind of assassination, like we have in not in our movies, but in other movies that you see. So there is a specific shot called trunk shot, which is always low angle, and it shows again, from the point of view of the person trapped. Bad things are happening, right? This person now is in charge. These people are in charge. So the low angle shot really and the high angle shot really kind of try to create metaphors of power dynamics. Now, the last idea we're getting into in terms of structuring a shot is the quadrant system. So, this idea is kind of fundamental compositional principle that most photographers and cinematographers use to create a sense of rivalry or competition of dominance during a shot or scene as well. So, if I don't necessarily want to use the high angle, low angle, if I don't necessarily want to use the dynamic, static, or rule of thirds, I could use the quadrant system. And it's used in photography and film, but it usually establishes two narratives simultaneously. And that's the idea. Again, going back to the mise en scène, we're still telling a story visually. It usually portrays one subject as dominant and one as subservient, which applies to people or objects in the frame, right? Or still composite, right? So it is, and then again, I'll post a video as well, but it is kind of an important aspect. So one of the great examples that we've seen so far is Macbeth. Macbeth, with uh, the quadrant system, uses a lot of important aspects. So let's look at how it's functioning in just this shot alone. So notice we have our two main characters, right? We have Macbeth, Lady Macbeth. We're joined in the middle by them holding hands. But if we draw the line, that's where we get the quadrant, right? We look at what this character's feeling versus this character, right? What are they doing to join these two characters together? So when we look at, from top to bottom, again, you see the concern, right? And you see again the holding hands, right? That's important to create that sense of unity between these two characters. Once we isolate each character, again, then we kind of see what the issues are for those characters, right? The fear, right? He's of course more concerned than her. So then we have again another way to characterize and also tell that visual narrative. So it works really well, of course, for this kind of story you're going to tell. Another good example, and this is both with, again, each quadrant, when we divide the image, right, by horizontal and vertical, right, we see the two different stories, right? We have our navigator asleep. We have, again, the main character still trying to protect her. So we see that kind of narrative in play. What also do we see? Well, the dominance between the car and then, of course, the plane, right? So the plane smaller in the background, our hero much larger in the foreground. And so it's just a way of again of creating a power dynamic, right? And so a lot of times cinematographers and directors will always play with these ideas in mind in order to create a good visual story throughout each shot, frame, and so forth. Obviously, if you have any questions, always post them to Canvas. If not, best of luck to you during the rest of the semester, and take care.